Now the pressure's on. Hi, everybody. Well, welcome to the OVS Training Center webinar, Building and Sustaining Personal and Professional Resilience. I'm Blake Cush. I'm Director of Training and Outreach at OVS. In the coming weeks, many regions in New York will have officially started the transition forward, if they haven't already, and on the way to reopening and to a return to in-office and some in-person work. And we understand that that transition comes with a lot of excitement, challenges, and some questions. We're here to So today's webinar is actually our fourth in the new Transition Forward webinar series, which will develop the goal of helping you tackle some of those and unique challenges in situations. A full list of the upcoming trainings that remain in the series are on our website at obs.ny.gov/training. And actually, Amy, if you advance the slide, you can see the next ones. We have the third one as well.
Yep. There you go.
There it goes. So plan is for the rest that we have. In addition, all of our trainings are recorded and they are then subsequently published on our OVS YouTube training channel. And that channel and all the upcoming and previous ones that have been recorded are also available on that obs.ny.gov/training website. So as soon as you exit today's webinar as well, you'll be directed to an evaluation survey on the presentation. Take a couple minutes if you can, give us some feedback. You also have an opportunity to notify us if you're interested in receiving some more follow-up on training. Those surveys really only take a couple minutes. I think it's less than 11 questions. And some people have told us that when they WebEx or whatever browser you use has a security feature, that when you exit today's webinar, it'll say you're now being redirected, do you approve or do you authorize? And it is safe. It's a research.net URL, which is a custom survey. So please give us the feedback. We share that with our trainers and use whatever feedback we can get from that to immediately improve whatever we can for you guys in our next offering. So today's webinar will be led by Dr. Amy Nitze. She is the director of the Institute for Disaster Mental Health at SUNY New Paltz. She's returning to present for us. Dr. Nitze is a psychologist, specializes in providing mental health training in academic and non-academic settings, both nationally and internationally, with an emphasis on disaster mental health and trauma recovery. She's currently collaborating with UNICEF USA to develop and implement a program of mental health support for children impacted by hurricane in Puerto Rico. Amy's also the author and editor of numerous publications, including the recent book, Disaster Mental Health Case Studies, Lessons Learned from Counseling in Chaos. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Amy Nitze.
Thanks, Blake. Good morning, everyone. What we wanted to do today in terms of this transitioning forward is just, I think it's pretty clear to all of us at this point that the changes that are going to come as we transition forward are going to be accompanied by an ongoing series of stressors and demands for change in the way that we do our work and the way that we manage our lives. And so we just wanted to spend some time today talking about sort of framing the stress and framing the idea of resilience. And what I'd like to do is give you a way to think about resilience and a way to think about sustaining your resilience as you go forward and do this important work, both in terms of caring for yourself personally, but also in terms of being able to sustain the important work that you all are doing. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the kinds of stress and sort of conceptualizing what's going on probably for all of us right now, and then transitioning into talking about building and sustaining resilience. So just starting with talking about the impact of stress. So all stress is not created equal, and I think it's helpful in this current context because there are so many different types of stressors that are kind of coming at us from all directions to sort of tease that out a little bit. And so I'm going to talk about general, cumulative, acute, and traumatic stress, and kind of what those look like in the current context. So general stress is a normal condition of life, right? It activates us to do what we need to do to get through our day. So it's really necessary to some extent, for some amount of it is, for our health and survival. And so it can be positive or it can be negative. Most people deal with the stressors that come at us on a daily basis pretty well. I grabbed this little graphic from the internet, but just to distinguish stressors from stress. So stressors are the pressures that come at us from the outside. So these are demands from the environment for change of some sort. And then stress is our internal response to those demands for change. And so, I think there are times in which we can control the stressors. We can control the pressures from the outside, certainly. But if the current situation has taught us anything, I think one of the things it's taught us is that a lot of times things we thought we had control over in the environment, we actually don't have control over in the environment. And so in those times when we don't have control over those things, what we do always have control over, if we work to maintain our resilience, is how we respond to those things. And so that's really going to be the focus of today, is how we build up our capacity to manage and sustain ourselves as we manage whatever is coming at us from the outside. So as I said a minute ago, stress is really our own internal response, our physiological response to a demand for change, and it's not all bad. So there's a certain amount of stress that we need to activate us to get through our day. And so if we don't have enough of it, we might be in this place of sort of lethargy or being unmotivated. And then there's an optimal amount that really allows us to be productive, to be successful at our jobs, or to meet whatever demands come at us in a day, at work or at home. But then, as you can see, too much of a good thing is not a good thing. So that our productivity overall in our lives goes down when it becomes too much stress, and that's what we could refer to as distress. So cumulative stress is piled up, unresolved general stress. So this is the stuff that comes at us every day. If we're not able to manage it and deal with it as it comes up, and it piles up, it becomes destructive. It becomes destructive in terms of our mental health and our physical health, in terms of our work performance, in terms of our interpersonal relationships and the way that we interact with the people around us. And it can even create negative changes in our personality, the way that we are in the world. And so it takes a toll, and it takes a toll in terms of, the way the hormones that are circulating in our body, the stress hormones that aren't meant to circulate over time, they're meant to be short term. And then that cascades into all these other negative changes. Acute stress, on the other hand, is our body's response to a situation that we perceive as dangerous or threatening. So this is an immediate response to a dangerous situation, and it's that what we refer to as a fight or flight or fight, flight, freeze reaction as our body prepares to defend itself. So this is that quick reaction that you get when something feels fearful or when you feel fearful about a situation that you perceive as dangerous or threatening in some way. So this is that, I think you all know what this feels like. Our hearts start to race, our breathing gets shallow, and we feel this sort of overall overwhelming sense of panic. And so that's different than chronic stress or the cumulative stress that I just talked about, but you could also experience both at the same time, which I think is what a lot of us are going through right now, which really creates a complex set of situations to deal with. And then there's also traumatic stress. So this graphic is intended to display that traumatic stress is one form of stress. So we have general stress, which is our response to a demand for change. Crisis is a form of stress that we experience when the demand for change feels like more than we can handle. So when what's coming at us feels like more than we can cope with using our normal coping resources that we already have. And so one of the things I want to do today is offer you some ideas about how you can build up your toolbox of those normal coping strategies so that crises don't feel like crises quite so much. But then traumatic reactions are exposure to, or traumatic stress is exposure to events that feel like a threat to our life or a threat to our safety, either physically or psychologically, or watching that happen to someone else. And these are experiences that are accompanied by a sense of terror or intense fear, terror, helplessness. And the reason that we have the red circle both inside and outside the diagram there is because traumatic experiences can have a different biophysical or neurophysical reaction. They're designed, or they're beyond, these are experiences that are beyond what our bodies and our brains were designed to be able to handle. And as such, they have a different sort of reaction in our brains, and they have a different sort of reaction in our bodies, or they can. And so these are, today isn't going to be a talk specifically about traumatic stress, but traumatic stress is something that I think we're, different pieces of what's been happening lately can be experienced as traumatic to different people. And so that is layered on top of these other components of stress. So I think what this looks like in the current context is that we all brought our pre-existing stressors to the current situation. So whatever was going on in our lives before the pandemic started, our general sense of stress, and maybe that was piling up and becoming cumulative stress for us anyway. And then the pandemic happened, and there are all these aspects of this threat about it being invisible and unpredictable, and it's sort of a chronic situation now, right? We've been dealing with this for, I've lost track, but a while. But there's also rapidly changing rules and rapidly changing information about how to keep yourself safe. Is it airborne? Is it not? How many people can I be in a room with? So there's all these, so there's this baseline of how it's changed all our lives, and then these different waves of perhaps these more acute stressors as we learn different things, or as the rules for navigating the situation change for all of us. When am I going to go back to work? What are the expectations going to be there? And then on top of that, now we have these more visible incidents of racial injustice and police brutality that are getting more attention. Not that they haven't always been there. But for some people, this has been a chronic issue. And now you layer on that the acute and traumatic events that, even watching those things on TV can cause a trauma reaction. And so if you put all these things together, I think what we have is this constant need to adapt, sort of a constant heightening of our baseline stress, the level of stress that we manage on a daily basis, combined with these multiple incidents of acute fight or flight stress. And so we're all operating from this heightened baseline, combined with these ongoing set of things that feel acute and feel particularly unsafe and threatening, potentially traumatic, which is, it's just a lot. And the need to take care of ourselves, I think, has been made visible in a way that it hasn't before. So I want to spend a few minutes now talking about what that does at the level of what everything we just talked about does at the level of the brain, because that's what we're going to build on then to talk about resilience and how you could combat the effects of this stress on our bodies and our brains in a way that builds our resilience. So I'm going to do a little bit of brain science here, but bear with me. I'm doing it to build up to have the strategies that I want to talk about make some sense. So for purposes of today, I want to talk about the brain as having two parts: the emotional part of the brain, which is the back part, and the part that develops first, and then the rational part of the brain. So the emotional part of our brain is our brain and our body's alarm system. So it's designed to judge what is good and what is bad, what is pleasurable and what is scary or what is a threat. And then to make quick decisions to protect ourselves accordingly. So it's not a fine-tuned instrument, but it's not supposed to be. It's supposed to see the squiggly thing in the yard, immediately think that looks like a snake, you got to get out of here, without slowing down to decide if it's really a snake or if it's just the garden hose or whatever. So it's also important for purposes of what we're going to talk about later, that this is the part of the brain that develops first, and it's shaped by our early experiences. So the early experiences that we have with threat shape our map of the world and what we eventually as adults, see as safe or pleasurable or threatening. Okay, so our brains are shaped by our experiences, and that's going to come into play again later, but that's particularly important, or that's particularly relevant in early childhood. And then we have the rational part of our brain, which is the front part of our brain. We could call it the neocortex or the prefrontal cortex. And this is the part of our brain that's responsible for focusing on understanding and thinking about the world around us. So it's interpreting our experiences. So it's essentially interpreting the signals that we get from that emotional part of our brain. It's also responsible for regulating our executive functions. And these are the executive functions are the things that we do to navigate our world: planning, decision-making, setting out a series of steps, and then being able to execute those steps to get to an action, predicting the consequences of our actions. And it sort of then is able to keep us, when it's working well, it's able to keep us from acting on all our impulses. So the emotional part of the brain will send an impulse, sort of a recommendation about what we should do really quickly without thinking much about it. And then the rational part of our brain is designed to slow down and make a more fine-tuned decision by using these executive functions. So it functions more slowly than the emotional part of the brain. The emotional part of the brain first sends the signal, and then the rational part of the brain takes a second longer, analyzes the situation, and makes a decision. But its decisions are more fine-tuned. So it's able to take a deep breath and say, is that really a snake in the yard? Do I need to run in the house? Or is it just the garden hose and I just need to go scold my husband for not putting the garden hose away? Something like that. I'm not making that. That example is clearly a real life example for me. So one way to understand this that I like a lot is, this is not my work, this is the work of Bessel van der Kolk. He talks about the brain, metaphor of the brain as a smoke alarm and a watchtower. So the emotional part of our brain is the smoke alarm. So its job is to detect a potential threat, which in this case is a stressor. And then it sends a signal, it turns on the alarm. So the smoke alarm starts going off. And then the rational part of our brain is like more of a watchtower. So it looks over the environment, examines the threat, and then decides on a plan of action. And, is the house really on fire? Or is there just somebody left pot roast in the oven too long? And then it activates a plan accordingly. If it decides it's a real fire, we're going to get the kids out of the house and call 911. If it's the smoke from the pot roast, then we're going to open the windows and be annoyed with ourselves and order out for dinner, right? So once that plan of action has been activated, then the emotional part of the brain, the smoke alarm can go back off. And then there's no more smoke. It goes back to its monitoring function for detecting threats. That's how it works when it's working well. And the two parts of our brain then are designed to work together pretty well to keep us safe most of the time and keep us functioning well most of the time. So managing stress in our daily lives really relies on that balance between the emotional and the rational part of the brain. And the noticing the threat, and then the ability to act, to interpret and act on the threat accordingly, and then return to baseline monitoring. But in times of traumatic stress, but also in times of extreme built up cumulative stress, or this sort of, I think the stress we're under now, where we're at a heightened level of stress combined with these extreme moments, it's like the smoke alarm can get stuck in the on position. So it's triggered, and it can't shut itself back off. And that is overwhelming. If you think about just playing out that metaphor, if you think about that happening in your house, when the smoke alarm is going off, you really can't focus on much else until you're able to shut that smoke alarm off, right? It's not like you can just sit and enjoy a cup of coffee and read a magazine while that smoke alarm is going off. You have to find it, figure out what's happening, get the battery out, whatever. So all the brain's attention gets focused on trying to shut off the smoke alarm at the expense of other brain functions. And so what that means is that that rational part of our brain kind of goes offline, or it gets, another way to say it is it gets hijacked. The work of the rational part of the brain, thinking, planning, executing our actions, thinking through the consequences of our actions, memory, concentration, all of that gets disrupted or hijacked or goes offline as our brain is just trying to get that smoke alarm to shut off. And so the ways that we are normally effective at work in thinking through our day and making decisions about what needs to happen next and being able to concentrate when we need to, all that stuff becomes really, really challenging because that part of our brain is just not, it's just not online, and it's just not able to do its thing in the way that it usually does. So that's sort of what's happening to us in the current context. So what are we going to do about it? So the rest of the time now today I want to spend talking about how do we build our resilience in the face of all these things that are coming at us to respond to what it does, what it's doing to us internally. So this photo here is really intended to highlight that. We can't stop the rain necessarily, we can't stop the weather, but how do we create our own umbrellas for being able to protect ourselves better from the weather? So there are a lot of definitions of resilience out there, but the one that I want to use for today is resilience is being able to stay in or quickly return to that place of balance after it's disrupted because of a threat. So again, our brains work together, the emotional part and the rational part work together quite well when they're in balance. But extreme stressors or a buildup of a lot of general stress throws us out of balance, and that's going to happen. Our brains are designed to get out of balance quickly, just to protect ourselves from danger. But the problem is when we get stuck in that place. So resilience is being able to return to that place of balance after we've been disrupted. I hope that makes sense. I want to say, does that make sense? But I can't see anybody's faces, so I don't know if you're nodding or not. So it's another way, the frame I want to use, the language I want to use about that today, it's maintaining the ability to respond instead of react to the situations that are presented to us. So responding versus reacting. So responding, let's call that the green zone. And that's the place we want to be. That's our natural resting state, where our emotional and our rational brain are in balance, and we have the full capacity of all of our brain functions and all of our physiological reactions available to us to respond to what's happening to us. So it's our body's natural state of restoring and refueling, and it's our body's natural state of feeling safe and feeling equipped, fully equipped to deal with what's in front of us. Red zone or reacting is reacting from a place of from being in that fight or flight mode. So when we're in that place, our immune system, our cardiovascular system, all of our systems physiologically are disturbed, and we're acting from a place of perceived threat. We're acting from a place of deficit or disturbance, and our brain is not in balance. It's that place of hijack where our emotional brain has hijacked the functions of the rational brain. And so we are not functioning from our fully resourced sense of all the coping abilities that we normally have available to us. We're acting from a really limited set of options. And reactive mode is important. The red zone is important, but it's intended to be a quick response to an immediate threat. It's not intended to be a way of life. And so, but if we're not careful with the demand from the multiple ongoing demands from the environment that we're all experiencing right now, we sort of are living in this, what Rick Hansen, who wrote a book called Resilient, calls the pink zone. We're sort of living in this place of almost in fight or flight all the time, which takes a toll, as I described earlier, takes a toll on our bodies, on our relationships, on our ability to do our work. And so resilience is being able to quickly get back to the green zone once you've been triggered into that red zone, okay? It's not about eliminating the red zone altogether. We do need that to be able to respond to emergencies, but real threats, not the just buildup of chronic stuff that we're all experiencing right now. So to think about how to do that, I think the biggest takeaway that I have for you today is that it's about preparing and rehearsing. In order to be able to activate a strategy to manage a red zone experience, right? An experience where you feel triggered emotionally, or where you're in that fight or flight place, you need to already have that strategy in place. So it's a lot easier to activate a pre-existing strategy than it is to develop one in the moment. We don't learn well when we're in that. We can't think clearly when we're in that fight or flight place. That's the whole point. And so we need to have our internal resources for coping already built and already established, so that when we need to call on them and draw on them from our toolbox, they're there and they're ready to go. And so this requires thinking about long-term investments in our own wellness and developing daily routines, so that in those stressful moments, those level 1 experiences up there, that we are able to call on strategies that we've built up over time. So this is another way of saying that. We develop psychological resources like resilience by having sustained and repeated experiences of them that are turned into durable changes in our brains. So I said a minute ago that when I was talking about the brain, that our brains are shaped by our experiences. And that's really important. That happens a lot during childhood, but it is still happening and can still happen, as adults. And so it's a matter of rehearsal and rewiring. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but it's like riding a bike. So it's that practice over and over that makes it automatic and gets built into our I guess, muscle memory, so that we don't have to relearn it every time. So repeated experiences that are turned into durable changes in our brain. So rehearsal leads to rewiring. And the way that I was taught this in graduate school that's easy for me to remember is that the cells in our brains that fire together wire together. So when we have an experience that connects to brain cells or two parts of our brain together, when those cells fire together repeatedly, they're going to wire together. So we're literally shaping our brains, reshaping our brains, just like they are shaped when we were little, when we were young, by our early childhood experiences. We can redo that now. So whatever we do and do repeatedly is becoming wired into our brains. So one way of saying this, which sounds a little hokey, but it's actually true physiologically, is that what we focus on is literally becoming a part of us, because we're wiring those things into our brain. So I'm going to get more into this in a minute, but can you keep your attention? What are you paying attention to? And what's landing for you? What are you holding on to? Are you paying attention to and focusing on the positives, on the enjoyable moments of your day, on things that bring you joy? Or are you getting stuck on the negative things, the worries? And whichever one of those things you're focusing on now, you're more likely to focus on in the future, because those are the connections in your brain that are getting wired. So that's sort of what I'm asking you think about in terms of building resilience being about building up your brain's capacity to return back to that place of balance when you get triggered. And doing that is going to take focused rehearsal and practice over time so that it becomes not just an experience that you're having, but it becomes a set of new wiring in your brain that allows you to be able to do that. So now I'm going to talk about some strategies and pathways for doing so. So this slide is intended to make the point that our thoughts and our emotions and our behaviors are all intricately connected, and they all influence and are influenced by each other. And so the thoughts that we think shape the feelings that we feel, which in turn shape the behaviors that we display. And vice versa. And so our behaviors have an influence on our emotions, and the way that we feel influences our thought patterns. So the reason that this is important here is because there's you can start then from any of these places. And so some people are more comfortable starting with, they're just more comfortable living in that place of thoughts and cognitions and rationality, I guess. Some people are more comfortable in the emotion state and thinking about emotion regulation and those kinds of things. And some people are more comfortable in the space of behavior. So that's, physical exercise or getting enough sleep or what am I eating? So more physical things. And the good news here is that you can start from any of those places. And so I'm not here to say do this thing or do this thing, because what's most important is that you pick something that you're going to be likely to stick with, so that it allows for that rehearsal that I just talked about. So I'm not going to focus much on the behaviors. Behavior, what I mean in that category again are things like physical exercise, getting enough sleep, getting enough to eat, and the positive impact on those things physiologically in our bodies allows for better changes in our thoughts and our emotions. But that's not, so those things are good things to do and you should do them, but that's not where I'm going to focus today. So I'm going to focus on emotion-based strategies and then thoughts or cognitive-based strategies. And so the idea here is I'm presenting a menu of options. And so if there's one or two here that make some sense to you, then get to work on practicing those things and rehearsing them so that they become so you're building up the resilience muscles in your brain accordingly. So emotion-based strategies, the goals there are to, like I just said, to strengthen that mental muscle of the brain's balance. So strengthening the brain's ability to stay in or quickly return to a place of balance. To help with emotion regulation so that we don't get hijacked for as long by our emotions when we get into that red zone. So we're strengthening the ability of our brains to quickly just get back into balance. And relatedly, strategies like mindfulness, meditation, relaxation, yoga, they're allowing us to regulate our attention to allow us to hold our focus on something. And that's important because, again, what we focus on, our experiences, of all the experiences happening around us, what we focus on is what our brains start to work to, that's how our brains get wired. And so mindfulness practices and meditation practices strengthen our ability to decide for ourselves what we focus on and to hold our attention there. And it also allows us to notice and accept the reactions that we're having. And that's sort of the whole premise of mindfulness is awareness of what's happening to us. And being able to notice that gives us more control over it. I think sometimes there's a myth or some sort of belief that if we just ignore something, it'll go away. If we ignore a troubling thought, or if we try to ignore a disturbing emotion or an unsettling emotion, that it'll go away. And that's most often not true. They just get built up, and then they're going to come out in some other way. And so the ability to notice and hold our focus on something then gives us more power over it. So these emotion-based strategies, again, mindfulness, meditation practice, any sort of deep muscle relaxation, or breathing exercises, or yoga, which include also a physical component, but also has that mindfulness and breathing and relaxation component to it. All of those are strategies that allow us to practice this emotion regulation piece and this attention regulation piece. And there's some research about this, that even 2 minutes a day of mindfulness or a meditation practice really does the trick. But it's 2 minutes a day, not 2 minutes once. If you do it 2 minutes once, you have a positive experience. If you do it 2 minutes a day, now you have a skill that you can draw on. And I'm going to tell you a story from my own personal life about this, because it really, as much as my son hates it that I tell this story, I think it really makes the point. So my family lived in Bhutan, which is a Buddhist country, a kingdom that sits between the Tibetan part of China and India. It's a very Buddhist place, and so there's a lot of meditation that goes on a regular basis for everybody. And my kids went to school there, and as a part of school, they meditated 5 times a day. So it was just a regular part of their day. Every day was meditation. And my son was, I think he was 8 years old while we were there. And so he did this. He hated it. He hated that school. He did not like being in that country. He was not a fan of this meditation, but he did it. He was doing it 5 times a day anyway. And my oldest daughter was 16 at the time, and she was like an assistant teacher at that school. So she was learning these mindfulness skills, and then she was leading the children through these skills. Okay, so we have that experience in Bhutan, and then we go to, we have this great vacation planned in Thailand. So we're going to spend 2 weeks on the beach in Phuket. It's just going to be relaxing, and this is going to be sort of our transition back to the U.S. So we get to our hotel on the beach, and we haven't been there but about 5 minutes until my son somehow manages to crash through a sliding glass door, our sliding glass door in the hotel that goes out onto the beach. And so I hear this terrible crash. I don't know what has happened. He comes running in. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. And then I'm disoriented, trying to figure out what's happening. And my daughter yells, "Trey, your leg." And he and I both looked down, and I don't want to be graphic, but it was he was wounded severely. It looked to me like so severe that my immediate thought was I might lose him. And so then he panics, and then I panic. So we're all in that red zone place, right? Like extreme red zone place. He's screaming. I'm trying to figure out what the heck to do. I don't know how you call 911 in Thailand. And I'm just like, I'm about to lose my kid here. And somehow my oldest daughter had the presence of mind. So I'm trying to paint for you this picture of utter chaos, which it was. And just, it was an out of control situation suddenly. And my 16-year-old said, "Trey, do your brain brushing." So brain brushing is one of the meditation techniques that they've been taught, and they've been rehearsing 5 times a day. So in this moment of complete chaos, she says brain brushing. My son closes his eyes and is completely calm. Now, that only lasted for about 30 seconds. But in that 30 seconds, it gave me enough time to take a deep breath and make a plan, right? Like at least I was then able to regulate for a second, long enough to say, okay, I don't know how to call 911, so what am I going to do? I'm going to send my other daughter to go find the person, whatever. And when that 30 seconds was over, he went back to screaming, and he screamed the entire way to the taxi, to the hospital, to the stitches, to the whole thing. But the point of my story is that it was that rehearsal 5 times a day that allowed him, in that moment when my daughter said, "Trey, do your brain brushing," just her saying that word, he was able to access that strategy, even as he was hijacked, because it had been rehearsed and was wired into his brain in that way. So going back to that pyramid that I had earlier with, long-term wellness strategies and daily practice, and then being able to have a stress reduction strategy in the moment, in a stressful moment, that's what was happening there. He had that built up so that he was able to access it. If, on the other hand, in the middle of this chaos, my daughter had said, "Trey, I'm going to teach you a skill. What I'd like you to do right now is close your eyes And then if she tried to teach him brain brushing in the moment that he was having that panicked experience, of course it wouldn't have worked. That's absurd. We can't learn new information when we're in the red zone. We can't learn new skills when we're in the red zone, when we're reacting instead of responding. So again, just making the point that rehearsal, whatever of these strategies makes sense to you, get doing it now and get doing it every day, okay? Page up. Okay, I just want to say here, I'm not going to spend, this isn't going to be me teaching any specific mindfulness or meditation practice because they are readily available. There are a million apps and websites where you can learn these strategies, scripts that you can download, books, lots of resources out there about that. But I think the cognitive strategies, there's a little bit less out there, and so I want to spend the rest of my time today talking about the cognitive strategies. So the goal of the cognitive-based strategies, again, really they're the same goals, but you want to avoid sustained activation of the fight or flight system. So when we get triggered, when we get into that red zone place, the thoughts that we tell ourselves, what goes through our head in that moment, which for today, let's call self-talk. That's probably a term you've all heard. That can sustain, that's like the fuel for that fight or flight thing. So the more negative things we tell ourselves or catastrophic things we tell ourselves when we're in that fight or flight place, it's just fuel to keep being triggered. And so we can use our thoughts to get out of that fight or flight place. And the other piece here is to combat the brain's negativity bias. I'm going to talk about that in a second, but we're wired from an evolutionary perspective, we're wired to focus on negative things in order to keep us safe. But that's not helpful. It's only helpful when we're in real danger. So I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But so the strategies here are around being aware of your self-talk. So what is that chatter that goes on in your head? What is that, to really date myself, what is that tape recorder that plays in your head probably automatically without even you noticing it? So when something happens to you, what is that stream of consciousness that's on repeat? And is that full of self-criticism? Is it full of resentment? Is it full of negativity? Maybe. But again, if that's what's there, that when you're in that fight or fight place, that self-talk is the fuel to keep staying in the red zone, and you don't want that. So strategies that address your self-talk are things like cognitive restructuring. So that's about replacing the self-talk, those automatic thoughts, with thoughts that are more neutral or more realistic or more useful. Most of the time, negative self-talk like self-criticism doesn't get us anywhere. Well, it does. It gets us stuck in that red zone experience. And so this isn't about just think positively. That's not the message, but it's about noticing when the negative thoughts are really having a negative impact on you overall. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then the last one is stress inoculation. And we've done a presentation on stress inoculation here during the previous series. So I'm just going to mention it briefly after, because it is a good cognitive strategy. Okay, the brain's negativity bias. So we're wired this way. This is just the way we are, but we can combat it. So our brains are constantly scanning for bad news, for threats, and then we tend to focus on those things and hold on to those things at the expense of losing sight of the big picture. So one way of saying this that I have there at the bottom, and this is from the book I referenced earlier by Rick Hansen, is that our brains are Velcro for bad experiences and Teflon for good ones. So we're just wired to grab onto or to hold on to the negative experiences. And the good ones kind of just can slip away. So an example of this for myself is when I get my teaching evaluations at the end of the semester, if I have 25 students and I have 24 who said something really positive about my teaching, or maybe we'll say 23, and then I have 2 that were really critical of me, guess which ones I'm going to focus on that night, right? When I go home at night, I'm going to stew on those 2 negative ones and be like, yeah, those good ones were great, but still 2 people said this thing about me. So that's an example of really, Velcro for the bad experiences, but the good ones are just, are slippery like Teflon. So this becomes a really vicious cycle where those negative experiences or those the bad news pieces get wired into our brain again. The cells around that wire together. They fire together, so they wire together. And then this creates a vicious cycle where then we're primed, where our brains are sensitized then to look for bad information. So we're going to see that information, and it just keeps cycling that way. But just because that's sort of our instinctual way of being does not mean it has to be that way. And this idea of cognitive restructuring is what we can use for that purpose. So cognitive restructuring is this idea that it's not what happens to us that creates the outcome, but it's what we tell ourselves about it that influences the outcome. So, the same person, 2 different people can have the same experience and interpret it very differently based on what they tell themselves. And that's that self-talk piece, right? So to put this into a really brief explanation, if you think of it as ABC. So A is the activating event, so it's what happens to us. So I had a teaching, I got my teaching evaluations back, and there were 23 good ones and 2 bad ones. Then the B is the belief, that's the self-talk. So that's the piece where I start to make sense of that. And so if my self-talk is, wow, 2 people really did not like me this semester, or 2 people really thought that my course was boring, or 2 people really thought that my, that my lectures were too easy, whatever the negative thing was. Then the consequence of that, the C is the consequence. So that's the outcome. So the consequence of that is I'm going to go home and be really sad. I'm going to that's going to fuel a whole other set of negative self-talk around I'm a bad teacher, or I don't know what I'm doing, or people don't like me. So whatever that sort of loop is that's playing in my brain, I'm just going to make it worse by holding on to that self-talk. So the intervention there is around changing. I can't change the event. I'm not, at this point, I can't change this teaching evaluation. But what I can change is what I tell myself. So I can notice that I'm focusing on those 2 negative teaching evaluations. And I can intentionally then go back and reread the 23 good ones and really focus on holding my attention again on those 23 and let myself think about and review and rehearse all the good things that happened over the course of that semester. The consequence there is that I probably end the night feeling a little bit better about myself, feeling a little bit more confident in my teaching ability. It doesn't mean that I'm ignoring those 2 negative ones, but it means that I'm choosing to channel my attention to the positive ones. But again, not just to make myself feel better in the moment, but to start the process of practice and rehearsal of focusing on things that are going to be more productive in order to build my resilience for the future. Okay, so this is the idea of cognitive restructuring. And so the way that the emotion strategies and the cognitive strategies fit together, or an example of how they are really so interconnected, is that if I'm doing mindfulness practice where I'm really paying attention to my thought processes, right? If I'm strengthening my ability to notice my own inner chatter, then it's going to be a lot easier for me to identify this belief, so that if I want to work from a cognitive place, I'm able to notice what is the self-talk that I'm doing in order to be able to change it. So the emotion-based strategies really make it easier for me to apply this cognitive strategy. Okay, so the last slide, and if you've been with us before, you've seen this, but the last strategy under the cognitive set of strategies is stress inoculation. And so stress inoculation is an intentional process of mental preparation and mental rehearsal to deal with a specific situation. Okay, so you're going to take, the idea here is to start by naming it in order to tame it. So you're going to focus on specifically what about the situation is causing you distress. So this situation, as we talked about at the beginning of this presentation, is really overwhelming, and there are a lot of components to it. And what I know for me personally, what feels completely distressing to me on one day, or the most distressing to me on one day, is very different than what feels stressful to me the next day. So, or what's stressing me out may be very different than, Carla and Rebecca in my office, what's stressing them out on a given day. So taking the big thing called this situation that we're all in, and breaking it down into what specifically are the stressors that are impacting me right now. Being as specific and concrete as possible, breaking it down into its smallest component. Then you're going to take a look at each stressor and see if you're perceiving it as a threat, or are you perceiving it as a challenge. So another way of saying this, I should have recoded these colors, but if you see it as a challenge, you're more likely to be able to address it from a green zone place, from that place of responding. When you're working from that green zone place, you are more likely to have access to all your coping skills, because your brain is in balance, you're fully resourced, you're in a place of relaxation and restoration, you're not in a place of fighting off a threat and defending yourself. But if you're seeing the stressor as a threat, if you're perceiving it that way, then that probably means you're in that red zone place. When you're in that red zone place, you're not as able to combat the stressor or to take the stressor on head on with all of your resources internally around you. So the step here, again, is to try to get from, if you're seeing it as a threat, if you're about to respond to this from a red zone place, is there anything that you can do to reframe it to get it so that you're in the green zone? Can you reframe the threat to see it as a challenge using the self-talk that we just talked about, focusing on what are you telling yourself about the situation, and is there a way that you could use some more helpful self-talk to allow yourself to see it as a challenge? That also involves remembering your strengths, slowing down and identifying the coping skills and the resources that you do have will allow you to get into more of a green zone place. And then also reaching out for support. And that's not something that I focused on too much in this presentation, but we know from research, also just from the wisdom of people over generations, right, that being connected helps us deal with stress. And there's actually research that says that people who perceive themselves as having more social support are more likely to recover more quickly. So part of your internal resources includes building and sustaining your support network, your connections to other people. Okay, so then that whole step, all of that was to say, do what you can to figure out, first of all, are you perceiving this and about to respond to this stressor from a red zone place or a green zone place? And if you're in that red zone place, what can you do to get yourself into the green zone? Then you can use that rational part of your brain. You have access to all the parts of your brain to sit down and think about, is this something that I can control or change, or is this something that I can't? Do I have control over the outcome here? If I do, if there's parts of this that I have control over the actual situation itself, then I can employ problem-focused coping strategies. So these are breaking the problem down into manageable parts and using problem-solving or brainstorming type strategies to think through rationally what I need to do and then do it. But again, that requires sequencing, making a plan, being able to execute that plan, all of which is really hard to do if you're in that red zone place. So that's why the piece about reframing the threat to a challenge is so important. But as we know from the current situation, there's a lot of parts of this that we don't have control over. But even when we don't have control over the external situation, we do have control over are internal reactions. And so for those, then you want to focus on the emotion-focused strategies, which are the things like emotion regulation, relaxation, mindfulness, deep breathing. There are other emotion regulation and anger management strategies that I have not talked about here today. And then as a final resort, distraction. Distraction is not a good long-term strategy, but it's a great short-term strategy. In the moment when there's nothing else to be done and something feels intolerable, what can you do to distract yourself from it? And so in my office, we talk a lot about cat videos, but there are certainly other ways to distract yourself as well. Stress baking. I know Carl was a fan of stress baking. Again, that's not a strategy we recommend as a skill over time, but it is a good in the moment strategy, especially if your other strategies are not working in that moment. So that's the process of stress inoculation, and that's how stress inoculation can be used to reinforce resilience, right? By helping you get back into and stay in the green zone. And then once you're in that green zone, being able to use the rational part of your brain to make a plan and execute that plan. Okay. So the very last slide. It's not, again, going back to that the graphic that had thoughts and behaviors, thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. What you do is less important than picking something and doing it regularly. So pick something from any of those categories that you're likely to stick with, something that feels pleasurable to you, and make it a regular practice. And the reason that's important, again, is because doing something once creates a temporary positive experience, but doing something repeatedly creates lasting change, even at the level of the brain, right? And that allows your brain to get back into balance more quickly. And again, this is a repeat, but to grow any psychological resource, and in this context I mean resilience, is to have repeated experiences of it that create lasting changes in your brain, which then create lasting changes in your coping ability. And that's resilience. Okay, with 1 minute to go, those are the end of my slides. So, Blake, I can turn it back over to you to
Sure. So
navigate the Q&A process.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. We typically see a lot of people jump up. So if you are going to take off, we appreciate you coming. And I want to thank Dr. Nitz and her for putting together today's webinar. It was awesome and super timely. Don't forget to do your evaluation when you can. We promise we won't just focus on the negative ones either. we'll practice positive evaluation reviews. And then join us next week for the coaching to high performance.
Said than done, let's be honest.
It's so true. It's so true. So if you want to leave and jump off, you're great. Thank you for joining us. But if you want to stick around and do some questions, we're happy to be here and answer anything you have. Is my go-to. You're muted, Amy, sorry. A couple more questions about today's slides. So I'll share that with everyone. Again, this webinar is recorded and we'll share it. It'll probably take about 2 days to get uploaded to our YouTube channel. And typically we send out an email to all of you with a link to that. Not seeing Rebecca or Clara, do you guys have any emails going directly or chat questions going directly?
Yeah, I don't see any on my end, Blake.
Okay. Give it another minute. Quiet crowd today.
Amy, it's Carla. I guess you answered everyone's questions.
Right.
Covered it all.
With the gray background, just put everyone to sleep.
Somebody asked me if we can email PowerPoint slides, and we will. They will get. I just linked them in the chat feature, but you'll also get them in the email that announces it's the today's webinar recording is available online. So yes, stay tuned another day or two for that. Oh, someone recommending getting their family to watch this recorded webinar.
Wow.
There's some negative Nellies. It's a great idea. Although that might get me in water, then I'm willing to a chance. So really, Amy, I think you should share with us all how big of a deal this leaving the hose out thing is. Is somebody has been water for leaving the hose out?
It was one traumatic moment, but I carry resentment that I have not been able to let go of. Now just when I see the hose in the yard, I'm like, really? Because don't you remember what happened that time? And my son is now 14, and he's totally fine. He barely remembers that incident, but he has a vicious, cool scar on his leg that he's pretty proud of.
Wow.
So happy ending on that end.
Pretty scary moment, huh?
It was so bad. But we got to...
What was it? Was it tempered glass?
I guess. It makes no sense. He wasn't running. He just didn't see that it was closed and walked into it. But they upgraded us to this giant suite in the hotel, I think, because they thought we were going to sue them. And so he had this giant pirate ship bed. And it was, so we got he had to be in a wheelchair the whole week and couldn't get in the water, but we had a really cool suite. And
yeah. That's cool. I just got a question. This is, any comments on resilience strategies for individuals or clients with limited resources or chronic system involvement?
Chronic system involvement meaning like foster care system or juvenile justice system, is that what that means?
Yeah. That's how I would interpret it. If you ask that question, you want to reiterate or clarify. Yeah. I think it's,
even
specific
just
strategies tailored for that population.
Yeah, there are a lot of I'll send you one. Rebecca, can you make a note for us to send him the elephant and the fly breathing exercise? So there's some really simple breathing exercises that you can teach to adults and to kids. Kids pick up on this stuff really well, and these strategies help give kids a sense of control over their bodies, which is also, it's a side benefit that's really valuable. But, these are things that you can teach them to do that they can sort of memorize the practice of and do without, it's no cost and simple and visual.
Pretend there's a fly on your nose. Is that it? It's
like, pretend there's an elephant on your belly and then breathe in and out. Pretend so it's focusing your attention on a certain part of your body. So it's that rehearsing of channeling your attention combined with then relaxing and tightening and relaxing that part of your body. But any little script like that can work. So I can send you a couple that you can post if that would be helpful.
Yeah, put those resources in the, just so everybody's still listening, we'll put those resources in the notes of the YouTube video. So when you click on the link, once it's published, you can have links to all of our websites, and I can we'll also put that in there. And somebody asked if we can forward those resources. Well, yeah, maybe we'll make sure we include it all in the email announcing that the video is published.
Sure.
We can do it right now. Amy, somebody wants you to do a presentation for their team. So I would say that's positive review.
For their what?
What we can do is for their management team. You would be great. We do have resources for you guys. Yes, well, all of their contact information will be put up there as well, so you can reach out. But I take that as a positive review of today's presentation and of your facilitation skills.
Thank you.
I'm not seeing much. Yeah, the lots of positive feedback regarding the description of emotional versus rational parts of the brain. Very helpful.
Good.
Yeah, I don't see much else. Well, we'll let everybody have some time back in their day, go take a break, and join us next if you can. Again, stay tuned. Maybe 2 days before we get these links all cleaned up and ready for posting. So stay tuned for an email about that. And yeah, thank you for joining us. Amy, thank you. Carla, Rebecca, we appreciate
Always
your
a
time
pleasure.
today.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Bye, everyone. Take care.